He told his friend he'd already forgotten her. That was before dinner. By the second course, he had stopped pretending to listen to anyone else. Across the city, she hung her grey dress on its peg, a thought of nothing. He sent his valet before the candles burned to the sockets. Her name. Just her name. He told his friend he'd already forgotten her. That was before dinner. The Duke of Sternfield sent his valet into the night with a single instruction: find the woman's name, and we shall come to why. But first, let us go back 3 hours, to the moment before he knew he needed it, when he still believed himself safe inside the fortress he had spent 5 years building out of nothing but discipline and the quiet, corrosive certainty that no one would ever be permitted close enough to take from him again. Julian Ashworth stood at the edge of Lady Marguerite Calder's ballroom, with his right thumb hooked through his gold watch chain, and if you had looked at him, really looked, past the midnight navy tailcoat and the ivory silk waistcoat, and the cravat tied with the geometric precision of a man who believes that control over small things is the only honest kind, you would have seen a tall figure, 6'2", broad-shouldered, military straight, chin lifted just enough to suggest that the world had been weighed and found adequate, but not interesting. Dark chestnut hair swept back from the forehead and curling past his collar, pale grey eyes that caught the candlelight and turned almost silver, set deep beneath straight dark brows, high sharp cheekbones, a thin mouth pressed flat, a small pale birthmark on the right side of his neck, just visible above the cravat line, the one imperfection he could not starch into submission. £11,000 a year, Sternfield Park with its 40 empty bedrooms and its silence so deep you could hear the house breathing. 34 years old, master of everything and intimate with no one. 5 years earlier, Lady Sophia Trent had accepted his proposal in the Rose Garden at Whitcomb, and for 3 months, Julian Ashworth had committed the unforgivable error of believing that the woman who kissed him in the half-dark also meant the things she whispered there. She eloped with a cavalry officer on a Tuesday in April. That was not the wound. The wound was this. Before she left, she copied his private letters, the ones where he had been foolish enough to write what he felt, in his own hand, without irony, and she circulated them through 3 drawing rooms like party favours. His most unguarded sentences, read aloud over sherry by people who found his sincerity hilarious. He learned, in the space of a single London season, that his heart, once opened, became material for entertainment. So he sealed it. Like a dead letter, the narrator said, addressed to no one, returned to sender. Now, the Calder ball, 200 candles blazed in the chandeliers of Brierston House, and the cream of the county turned beneath them in silks that cost more than a labourer earned in 2 years. Lady Marguerite Calder presided from her customary chair near the fireplace, 5 feet 1 inch of pure, undiluted authority, wrapped in black silk and jet beading and 3 layered shawls, charcoal wool, black lace, deep plum velvet, arranged around her thin shoulders with territorial precision. Her bright, pale blue eyes, startlingly clear at 74, surveyed the room through reading spectacles pushed up onto her forehead. The ebony walking stick with the silver hound's head handle stood planted before her like a sceptre, and Julian attended this ball every year for the simple reason that Lady Marguerite was his great-aunt and the only living soul whose disapproval he could not survive. Charles Hartwell flanked him. Hartwell always flanked him. 5'9", soft-bodied, sandy blonde hair combed forward in a hopeful Roman style, claret-red tailcoat slightly too snug across the shoulders, a silver snuff-box he fidgeted with but never opened. He leaned toward Julian with the easy slouch of a man who treated every conversation like the best entertainment available, and he was, in his warm, hazel-green, perpetually amused way, the closest thing Julian permitted himself to a friend. Then Lady Marguerite summoned them both with a single tap of the walking stick, and brought forward Miss Eleanor Voss. She was, and the narrator chooses this word with care, present. Not dazzling, not decorative, present. 5'3", slight and fine-boned but square-shouldered, in a dove-grey wool dress with a high neckline and long sleeves, mended neatly at the left cuff. Honey blonde hair pinned up in a practical chignon, already losing strands at the temples. Dark, amber-brown eyes, steady and direct. A small, rounded nose dusted with freckles. A stubborn chin. No jewelry except a thin brass ring on the right hand. A cream linen fichu tucked at the bodice. Sturdy brown leather half-boots visible beneath the hem. She carried, in a deep pocket of her dress, a small leather-bound notebook with a pencil stub tucked in its spine, though Julian did not know that yet. She sewed for Mrs. Bancroft's shop. She kept accounts for the Leighton household. She was present tonight because she had altered Lady Marguerite's gown, and the old woman had insisted on repaying the debt with an invitation rather than coin, because Lady Marguerite Calder understood, with the ruthless clarity of 74 years, that a woman who works with her hands deserves to stand in a room full of people who have never worked with theirs. Eleanor curtsied precisely. She said 3 sentences, polite, complete, containing absolutely no flirtation, no upward lilt seeking approval, no simper, no performance. She said good evening, and that she was pleased to make his acquaintance, and that the candles were very fine. And then she withdrew. Just stepped back, turned, and was gone, absorbed into the crowd like a dropped stitch. Julian watched her go. Then he turned to Hartwell. "I've already forgotten her name." Hartwell laughed and raised his claret. Julian believed himself completely. He was wrong. But the narrator will not yet explain why. For the next 90 minutes, Julian danced with 2 heiresses, discussed drainage with a red-faced baronet, refused a hand of whist. Ordinary motions, safe motions, but something tugged at the edge of his attention. A grey dress in the periphery, a voice that had not risen at the end of its sentences, as though asking permission to exist. He kept turning his head toward a corner of the room without deciding to, and then he saw her one last time. Eleanor Voss was kneeling on the ballroom floor, mending a torn hem for a young woman she had never met. A needle produced from somewhere in that grey dress, with the calm efficiency of someone who has been fixing other people's problems her entire life. No one thanked her. She did not wait for thanks. She stood. She brushed her knees. She walked out the door. Julian stood alone at the edge of the ballroom floor, watching the space where she had been, and realized he could not recall whether her eyes were brown or gold, only that they had looked at him as though his title were an inconvenience she was tolerating. Julian cannot recall her eyes, but finds he can recall, with perfect fidelity, the exact motion of her hands as she threaded the needle, and this infuriates him. It infuriates him because he is the Duke of Sternfield, because he has spent 34 years training himself to notice only what is worth noticing, and because the hands of a seamstress, mending a hem at the edge of Lady Calder's ballroom, should not, by any reasonable accounting, qualify. And yet, the pale fingers, the economy of the gesture, no flourish, no hesitation, just the thread drawn through the eye of the needle in a single clean motion, the way a surgeon ties a suture or a soldier loads a rifle, muscle memory so deep it has become grace. He stood at the edge of the floor, watching the space where she had been, and now he turns on his heel and goes looking for Hartwell, because Hartwell knows everyone, and because Julian needs a name the way a man with a splinter needs tweezers, not because the splinter is dangerous, but because he cannot stop feeling it. He finds Hartwell draped across a settee near the card room, the silver snuff-box turning idly between his fingers, his claret-red tailcoat straining heroically at the shoulders as he leans back with the boneless ease of a man who has never once been troubled by his own existence. Julian's right thumb finds the gold watch chain at his left waistcoat pocket. He grips it. "The woman in grey," Julian says, "the one doing the alterations. Her name." Hartwell blinks. Those warm, hazel-green eyes, perpetually amused, take on the particular blankness of a man being asked to recall a servant. "The seamstress? The one in grey?" A deep-set dimple appears. Good Lord, Julian. There were 4 women in grey. It's Lady Calder's household. Everyone wears grey. I think it's a condition of employment, or possibly a punishment. It doesn't matter. Then why are you asking? It doesn't matter. Julian releases the watch chain, grips it again. Forget I mentioned it. Already forgotten, Hartwell says, and means it, because Hartwell forgets everything that does not directly concern his own comfort, which is both his worst quality and his most convenient one. It doesn't matter, Julian says a third time, to no one in particular. Now, a man who says it doesn't matter 3 times in 2 minutes is a man for whom it matters enormously. He knows this. He suspects Hartwell knows this. The difference is that Julian has spent a lifetime building walls out of composure, and Hartwell has spent a lifetime cheerfully ignoring walls, so neither of them will acknowledge what just happened, and both of them will be wrong about why. Julian sends his valet into the night. Poole, thin, silent, 53 years old, possessed of a face that reveals precisely as much as a closed ledger, receives the instruction in the corridor outside Julian's rooms. 9 years he has served the Duke of Sternfield. 9 years of laying out the midnight navy tailcoat, of polishing the black leather boots to a mirror shine, of winding the gold pocket watch with the engraved stag on its case and returning it to the left waistcoat pocket without being asked. Poole knows what this errand means, even if the Duke does not. He departs without comment, because a good valet is a man who has learned that the most useful word in service is silence, and the second most useful word is also silence. Meanwhile, across the city, in a world the Duke of Sternfield has never entered and cannot imagine, Eleanor Voss climbs the narrow stairs to her rented room above a chandler's shop in Threadwell Lane. £7 per annum this room costs her. 1 window, a pine table scarred with candle wax, a narrow iron bed with a woolen blanket she mended twice last winter, and 17 books she has read until their spines cracked. Poetry, arithmetic, a treatise on beekeeping she found for 2pence at a rag fair, 2 volumes of history so battered the covers have gone soft as cloth. She earns £23 a year from sewing, and 9 from keeping accounts for a grocer and a widow who runs a boarding house. That is £32. After rent, after tallow, after coal, after the bread and cheese that constitute supper most nights, she is left with a margin so thin you could thread a needle with it, which, given her profession, has a certain grim poetry. She sits at the pine table. She eats bread and cheese. She opens the small, leather-bound notebook, the one she carries in the deep pocket of her dove-grey dress, the pencil stub tucked into its cracked spine, and she writes. 3 shillings received for the Calder alteration. The evening neither pleasant nor unpleasant. The candles very fine. That notebook is her one luxury. Not because it cost her anything. She found it half empty behind a draper's counter 3 years ago, but because of what it holds. She records everything. The cost of tallow per ounce, the hours of daylight in November versus March, the number of stitches in a fitted bodice, 412 if done properly. The precise words people say when they think a seamstress is furniture. You wouldn't mind stepping aside, would you? Not there, further. Can she not do that somewhere less visible? The notebook is her proof that she exists, that her days are real, that she is not furniture. Her father was a clerk who died owing £40. Her mother followed him within the year, not from grief, Eleanor suspects, but from exhaustion, because grief is a luxury and exhaustion is a fact. Eleanor was 19, alone, with a skill and a brain that could hold numbers the way other people hold grudges. 9 years she has spent since then refusing every offer that came with a string attached. A cousin who would house her if she raised his children and kept her opinions behind her teeth. A shopkeeper who would employ her if she would also warm his evenings. And he smiled when he said it, the way men smile when they think poverty has already made the discretion for you. A charitable society that would feed her if she would perform gratitude for their donors, weeping prettily at annual dinners so that rich women could feel the pleasant warmth of their own generosity. She's chose hunger over performance every second time. Her impression of the Duke? She did not form one. He was tall. His cravat was good linen, well tied. He had that particular emptiness behind the eyes that belongs to men told since birth they are the most important person in any room. Men who have started to believe it means they need not actually be present in the room at all. She noted his watch chain, good gold, old, and the small pale birthmark on his neck above the cravat line, and touching different. Nothing at all. Eleanor sets down her notebook, blows out her single candle, and sleeps immediately and without dreams, having spent no part of her evening thinking of the Duke of Sternfield or anyone like him. Poole returns at 11:30 with a name, Miss Eleanor Voss, Seamstress, Threadwell Lane, and the Duke repeats it once aloud, as though tasting a word in a language he has only just begun to learn. And then Julian does something so utterly beneath his dignity, so profoundly absurd, that the narrator must pause here to savour it properly. He types his coat, a midnight navy tailcoat of fine wool that cost more than Eleanor Voss earns in a year, and he tears it, carefully, along the left seam, with his own hands. He stands in his dressing room at Sternfield House, gripping the fabric between thumb and forefinger, and he pulls until the stitching gives with a sound like a whispered confession, and certain feels ridiculous, and his often stop. A distrust to speak to a seamstress has already lost the argument he doing not yet know he is having. His valet sees the torn seam and nearly weeps. Julian waves him off. He has a seamstress in mind, he says, a recommendation. The valet's face does something covering. Julian ignores it. He changes into a plainer coat, still beautifully cut, still worth more than most men's wardrobes, but quainer, the way a diamond is plainer when you set it in silver instead of gold. And he leaves with a cross carriage. On foot, down streets he has never walked, through neighbourhoods that smelled of tallow and bread and Sonny Else's laundry. He gives his name at the door as Mr. Ashworth, and the lie tastes strange in his mouth, metallic and sharp, like biting down on a coin. Threadwell Lane is narrow and busy and completely indifferent to him. Eleanor's shop is not, properly speaking, a shop at all. It is the front room of the chandler's ground floor, rented from the building's owner for an additional £2 per annum, a sum she negotiated down from £3 by pointing out the damp in the east wall and the draught beneath the door. Inside, a cutting table scarred with years of blade marks, a dress form wearing a half-finished bodice pinned with military precision. 3 bolts of fabric she purchased at auction, 1 grey wool, 1 cream linen, 1 blue cotton, stacked neatly against the wall. Light comes from 1 good window facing the street, and she has positioned her work table to catch every minute of it. She looks up when he enters. The honey-blonde hair pinned in its practical chignon, loose strands at the temples catching that single shaft of window light. Dark, amber-brown eyes, steady and direct. The small leather-bound notebook, with its pencil stub tucked in the spine, sits at the edge of the cutting table, within arm's reach, the way a soldier keeps a weapon. She does not smile. She does not curtsy. She says, "Good morning. What needs mending?" Julian holds up the coat. She takes it from him without ceremony, turns it in her hands, finds the torn seam. Her eyes move along the damage with the focused calm of a surgeon reading a wound. She knows exactly what she is looking at. 1 shilling 6pence, she says. Julian, who has never in his life been told the cost of mending a coat, Julian, who has never in his life been told the cost of anything, because dukes do not encounter costs, they encounter invoices handled by other men, finds the specificity arresting. 1 shilling 6pence, not approximately, not negotiably, a price stated with the finality of a mathematical proof. She does not ask his business. She does not ask his family. She does not ask his reason for being in Threadwell Lane, which is good, because he does not have one that would survive inspection. She threads her needle and works. And here is what Julian sees, though he does not yet have the language for it. He sees competence so thorough it is a kind of beauty. Hands that know exactly where they are going. Fingers that move with the unconscious certainty of long practice, pulling thread through fabric in stitches so even they might have been measured with calipers. A woman who fills her silence with purpose rather than anxiety. She does not perform ease. She does not perform discomfort. She is simply occupied, and his presence is neither a gift nor an imposition. He is a torn coat that walked in. She will mend him, and he will leave, and the afternoon will continue. He has never been in a room with someone who treated him as though he was simply another customer. The experience is so novel it leaves him breathless, and he covers the breathlessness by studying a bolt of grey wool as though it contains the secrets of the universe. "Do you want the seam reinforced or matched to the original?" Eleanor asks, without looking up. Julian doesn't know what this means. He has worn coats his entire life and has never once considered the philosophy of their construction. She explains. Reinforced means a stronger stitch, doubled thread, a seam that will hold under strain but sit slightly thicker against the body. Matched means invisible repair, the original line restored, elegant and seamless, but no stronger than it was before it tore. Durability versus appearance. She delivers this with the patience of someone who explains things for a living and does not mind doing it again. And Julian chooses durability, and she nods, one small nod, like a door closing, as though he has passed a test he did not know he was taking. The shop door opens. A man steps in. Mr. Edmund Price, tall, lean, immaculately groomed, dark brown hair going grey at the temples and oiled into obedience. Cool, dark brown eyes that move slowly around the room as though appraising its value, which, in fact, they are. He wears a perfectly fitted black tailcoat and carries a slim black leather portfolio under his left arm. And he smiles the way a landlord smiles when he wants you to know he's being generous by not raising the rent today. "Miss Voss," he says warmly, "simply checking on the property." His gaze lingers on Eleanor with the proprietary ease of a man who regards a tenant's inability to leave as a form of consent. That smile never wavers, never reaches those watchful eyes. Eleanor meets his gaze levelly. She does not flinch. She does not look away. She holds the needle perfectly still. Price tips his hat, smooths one immaculate cuff, and departs. Something tightens in Julian's chest. He does not examine it. Julian leaves the chandler's shop with a mended coat and the disturbing certainty that Miss Voss charged him exactly what the work was worth. Not a farthing more, not a farthing less, and that she would have charged the same if he had been a grocer. 4 days passed before Julian Ashworth found reason to return to Threadwell Lane, and the reason he found was a waistcoat button, a single mother-of-pearl disc that he had, with considerable deliberation, pried loose from his ivory silk waistcoat with the tip of a penknife the night before. He presented it to Eleanor Voss with the gravity of a man delivering dispatches, and she looked at him with the particular steady patience of a woman who knows a button does not take 4 days to fall off. She did not say so. She simply took the button, examined its shank, threaded a needle, and began to work. They spoke. Not much, not warmly, but with a kind of careful precision that suggested both of them understood words were load-bearing structures and ought not be placed without consideration. Julian asked about the construction of the waistcoat, where she sourced her silk thread, how she judged the weight of a facing fabric. Eleanor answered each question the way she answered everything, with facts, delivered in order, stripped of ornament. Thread was 9p a skein for cotton, 2 shillings for silk, and she bought neither without counting what remained in the tin on the shelf behind her. Daylight lasted until 3:30 this time of year, and after that she shifted to accounts, because figures could be done by tallow candle, but fine stitching could not. Julian's right thumb found the gold watch chain at his waistcoat pocket. And beeswax candles? 4 shillings a pound. He did the arithmetic before she finished speaking. 4 shillings was 2 full days of her labour, 2 days of her life, converted into light so that she might work a third day. The economy of it was monstrous, and she described it as though reporting the weather. He offered to send candles, good ones, beeswax, a case of them. Eleanor Voss looked up from the button with those dark, amber-brown eyes, steady as a carpenter's level. "I have light enough, Mr. Ashworth." That was the second visit. The third visit was 5 days later, and Julian told himself he had come because the lining of his coat pocket wanted reinforcing, which it did, because he had carefully torn it with his thumb while pretending to read correspondence that morning. But he did not hand over the coat immediately, because when he arrived, Eleanor was already occupied with a customer, a merchant's wife in a green pelisse that cost more than Eleanor earned in a month. And the merchant's wife was doing what people like her always do to people like Eleanor. She was smiling. She was being reasonable. She was explaining, in the most pleasant, most patient voice, that the stitching on her hem was uneven, and that she could not, in good conscience, pay the agreed price for imperfect work. The stitching was not uneven. Julian could see that from 6 feet away, and he did not sew. Eleanor did not argue. She did not flush, or stammer, or appeal to fairness. She lifted the garment from the counter, held it to the light from the window, and with her pencil stub pointed to the first seam. 42 stitches per inch, consistent from here, the pencil moved, to here. The facing is cut on the bias and pressed flat, as specified. The hem is rolled, not folded, which is why it drapes rather than bunches. She set the garment down. The price is 11p. It was 11p when you commissioned it. It is 11p now. Not a negotiation, a fact, like the price of thread, like the hours of daylight. The merchant's wife paid in full and left without another word. Julian, who had watched men bargain over thousands of pounds of land, who had sat in rooms where the fate of whole estates turned on a handshake and a glass of port, had never in his life seen anyone defend 11p with such quiet, immovable authority. His chest did something it had no business doing. He ignored it, because he was Julian Ashworth, and Julian Ashworth did not have feelings about 11p. The fourth visit broke him. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon and found the shop closed, the door latched, the small hand-lettered sign turned inward. He went around to the side entrance, telling himself he was concerned, telling himself it was only reasonable to check, and stopped in the narrow passage that led to the backyard. Eleanor was outside, in the November cold. No shawl, no coat, just the dove-grey wool dress mended neatly at the left cuff. Before her stood the chandler's apprentice, a lanky young man of 19 with hollow cheeks and the hunted look of someone who has been made to understand he is expendable. His master had docked his meals for 3 days because he'd broken a mould. 3 days without supper for a cracked piece of tin. Eleanor set her own supper on the crate between them. Bread, cheese, half an apple, cut clean. Everything she had. She did not make a speech. She did not ask if he was grateful. She handed him the bread the way you hand someone a tool. Here, this is yours now, use it. She would go without tonight. Julian knew this the way he knew the price of beeswax and the stitch count on a rolled hem, because Eleanor Voss did not have surplus. She had exactly enough, and she gave it away, and she did it without ceremony because feeding someone who was hungry was simply what one does with food when one has it and someone nearby does not. Julian stood in the doorway and felt something in his chest crack along a seam he thought he had reinforced years ago. Not a small crack, a catastrophic one. The kind of failure that starts with a single thread pulled loose and ends with the whole garment coming apart in your hands. He told Hartwell about it that evening because Hartwell was the only man alive Julian trusted enough to be stupid in front of. Hartwell listened from his slouching position in the armchair, one hand draped over its back, the silver snuff-box turning between his fingers, his broad, round face shifting from amusement to alarm, like a man watching a carriage pick up speed toward a ditch. "You're telling me," Hartwell said, leaning forward with those hazel-green eyes wide, "that you've visited a seamstress 4 times under a false name, you've purchased services totaling 3 shillings, and you cannot stop thinking about her hands." He paused. The snuff-box stopped turning. "Julian, my dear fellow, you are in catastrophic trouble." Julian denied it. The narrator does not bother to pretend anyone believes him. Lady Marguerite's summons arrived the following morning, written in ink so black it looked like a verdict and sealed with wax the colour of dried blood. Julian obeyed, because one did not decline Lady Marguerite Calder. One simply arrived and endured. She was waiting in her drawing room, perfectly erect in black silk and jet beading, the 3 shawls, charcoal, black lace, deep plum velvet, arranged around her thin shoulders with territorial precision. The ebony walking stick stood planted before her like a scepter. Her reading spectacles dangled from their silver chain. Her pale blue eyes, startlingly clear, assessed him the way a jeweller assesses a stone, looking for the flaw, already certain where it is. She had heard. Through channels so efficient they would make military intelligence blush, Lady Marguerite had learned that her great-nephew had been visiting Threadwell Lane. She knew the street. She knew the shop. She very probably knew the stitch count. Julian tried to deflect. He mentioned the coat, the button, the perfectly reasonable need for a reliable seamstress. Lady Marguerite was not a woman who could be deflected. The walking stick tapped once against the floor, a full stop made of ebony and silver, and she interrogated him with the precision of a barrister and the mercy of a winter storm. How many visits? Under what name? What he had purchased and what he had paid? Whether he had looked at the woman's hands, or her face, or both? Whether he had slept properly since? Julian answered each question, because lying to Lady Marguerite was like lying to weather. It simply did not work. When he had finished, she lifted her teacup, drank once, and set it down in its saucer with a sound like a gavel. Those pale blue eyes, bright, narrowed, completely unimpressed by rank, fixed on him with the devastating clarity of a woman who had been watching Ashworths make fools of themselves for the better part of 50 years. You are not the first Ashworth to fall in love with a woman who did not need him. You are simply the first one foolish enough to think the disguise would hold. Julian lies awake that night, turning Lady Marguerite's words over like a stone in his hand, and by morning he has decided to do the one thing he swore he would never do again: tell the truth. But the truth, as it tends to do, had to wait in line, because Mr. Edmund Price got there first. He arrived at Eleanor's shop on a Tuesday, which was deliberate. Tuesdays were her quietest day, when the foot traffic on Barrow Street thinned to almost nothing, and the bell above the door might ring twice in 6 hours. Price knew this. Price knew everything about Eleanor Voss's schedule, the way a man knows the feeding habits of a bird he intends to trap, not out of fascination, but out of patience. He stood in her workroom with that slim black leather portfolio tucked under his left arm, his dark hair oiled back from that long, narrow face, and he smiled. He smiled warmly. He smiled the way a man smiles when he is about to press his thumb directly into a bruise and wants you to understand that he is being perfectly reasonable about it. The rent on her premises would increase by £3 per annum, effective in 60 days. £3. Let me put that in plain terms, so you feel it the way Eleanor felt it. Her total income, every shilling she earned from mending, alterations, The occasional new garment commissioned by women only slightly less poor than herself came to roughly £12 a year. £3 was a quarter of her life. £3 was the difference between a scuttle of coal per day in January and no coal at all. And Price knew it. He called it a market adjustment. He smoothed his cuffs before he said it, those cool, dark brown eyes watching her with the slow, unblinking patience of a man who has learned that stillness unnerves people and has never stopped using it. Then came the hint. Not a proposition. Price was far too careful for that. Just the suggestion, delivered with that warm smile that never once reached his eyes, that certain arrangements might be made. That Miss Voss was a woman of many talents, that flexibility, in these uncertain times, was a virtue. Eleanor's hands were still. The small, leather-bound notebook sat against her hip. The thin brass ring on her right hand caught no light, because there was almost no light to catch in that cramped workroom with its single tallow candle. She did not raise her voice. She did not give him anger, because anger is a handhold, and she would not give Edmund Price a damn thing to grip. The increase is noted, Mr. Price. I will have the sum, or I will vacate. Good evening. 7 words of dismissal, delivered like a closing argument from a woman who has been evicted before and survived it before and will survive it again, and who would rather sleep in a ditch than let a man like Price believe he owned even one of her choices. He left. He was still smiling. Now, Julian learned about the increase 2 days later from the chandler 3 doors down, a man who sold soap and candles and knew every tenant's business because tenants talk when they're frightened. Julian's first instinct, his reflexive, ducal, bred-in-the-bone instinct, was to fix it. Anonymously, through a solicitor, the way men with £11,000 a year solve problems, with money and distance, without ever having to watch the solution land. Hartwell stopped him. Charles Hartwell, who had spent most of this adventure slouching in chairs and fidgeting with that silver snuff-box he never opened, leaned forward with his broad, round face suddenly uncharacteristically serious. The dimples were gone. The amusement in those hazel-green eyes gone. If she finds out, and she will, Julian, because that woman misses nothing, she will never speak to you again. You will have made her into a charity case, and she would rather sleep in a ditch than be a charity case. That landed. You could see it land in the way Julian's right thumb found the gold watch chain and gripped it. So he went to her himself. He walked to Barrow Street on a Thursday afternoon, wearing his midnight navy tailcoat and his ivory silk waistcoat with the gold chain and his precisely tied cravat, and he stood in her doorway, those pale grey eyes almost silver in the thin autumn light, and he told her the truth. His name was not Ashworth. He was the Duke of Sternfield. He had no excuse for the deception except cowardice. He had wanted to stand in her shop without his title filling every corner of it. He had wanted to know if she would speak to him the same way if she knew, and he had been afraid the answer was no. Eleanor did not shout. She did not throw anything. She did not weep. What she did was worse. What she did was withdraw, carefully, precisely, the way a woman pulls her hand back from a stove she has just learned is hot. Not with surprise, with recognition, because Eleanor Voss had learned over 28 years of watching powerful people move through the world that when they pretend to be ordinary, it is always for their own entertainment and never for hers. She asked, in that steady voice, how many of his visits had been genuine commissions, and how many had been pretexts. Julian opened his mouth. Those sharp cheekbones went tight. The scatter of light freckles across the bridge of his nose stood out against skin that had gone very pale. He could not claim more than one was genuine. The mended coat. One. Out of all those visits, all those conversations, All those hours standing in her workroom, pretending to need alterations on garments that fit perfectly well. One was real. And then he did the thing that men of immense rank always do when they have broken something with carelessness and cannot bear the silence that follows. He reached for money. Not the rent, something larger. A banknote. Enough to clear her debts, move to better premises, buy proper wax candles instead of tallow. He meant it as respect. He believed in that moment that he was offering her freedom. Eleanor looked at the note. She looked at the man holding it. Those dark, amber-brown eyes, steady and direct, read him the way she read a seam, following every thread to where it pulled. Eleanor sets the banknote on the table between them, pushes it back toward him with one finger, and says, "I did not ask to be improved, Mr. Ashworth, or whatever your name is. I asked to be paid for my work. Please leave my shop." Julian walks home through streets that feel narrower than they did that morning, and for the first time in 5 years, he is not protected by the wound Lady Sophia gave him, because this pain is different. This one he earned. The banknote she pushed back across the table sits in his coat pocket like a coal that will not cool. Every step down Threadwell Lane, past the Chandlers, past the bakehouse with its yeast and ash smell, past the shuttered cobblers where old Fenwick died owing 11 shillings, every step lands harder than the last, because Julian Ashworth, Duke of Sternfield, 6th of his name, master of 4,000 acres and an income of £11,000 per annum, has just been dismissed by a woman who earns her bread mending other people's clothes. And she was right to do it. He does not send flowers. He does not send money. He does not send messages. 3 days pass in the tall silence of Sternfield House, and the servants move through the corridors the way birds move around a sleeping hawk, quietly, watchfully, giving the dark thing in the study a wide berth. Hartwell finds him on the 3rd evening. The claret-red tailcoat comes through the study door without knocking, because Charles Hartwell has never knocked on a door in his life and sees no reason to begin now. What he finds is Julian sitting in near darkness, the heavy curtains drawn, the fire burned to a white whisper of ash. The gold pocket watch lies open in his palm, the engraved stag catching the faintest thread of light from the hall. His father's watch. Given the day the old Duke told a boy of 19 in a voice like gravel shifting, that the measure of a man is not what he can acquire, but what he can relinquish. Hartwell lowers himself into the opposite chair, fidgets with the silver snuff box he never opens, says nothing for a full minute, which for Hartwell is an act of superhuman restraint. Then, quietly, "She threw you out, didn't she?" Julian's thumb finds the watch chain, grips it. "She asked me to leave. There is a difference." "Not from where you're sitting, old man." No, not from where he is sitting. Because Julian has spent years acquiring control over every room he enters. The precise cravat, the lifted chin, the military bearing that says, "I have already decided and you are welcome to agree." And Eleanor Voss, 5 feet 3 inches of mended grey wool and steady amber-brown eyes, is asking him to relinquish it, all of it. Not the money, not the title, the certainty. Meanwhile, because the world does not pause while dukes sit in the dark feeling sorry for themselves, Edmund Price tightens the screw. He arrives at Eleanor's shop on the 2nd morning, the slim black portfolio tucked under his left arm like a blade sheathed in leather. He smooths his gloves before he speaks. He always smooths his gloves before he speaks. The contract he produces is clean, precise, printed in a clerk's careful hand. A new lease at the higher rate, £42 per annum, requiring her signature within 30 days. Failure to sign means vacancy. Vacancy means the street. And then, oh, and then this man smiles with his mouth, while his cool, dark brown eyes stay perfectly, watchfully still. And he tells her that a woman of her quality deserves better than this little shop. That he could arrange something more comfortable, something suitable. The implication trails behind the sentence like a smell. Eleanor does not flinch. She sets her leather-bound notebook on the counter, pencil stub tucked in the spine, ledger of a life kept in figures that never lie, and tells him she will have his answer in 30 days. Not his terms, his answer. Because even in this, even staring down eviction, she decides what the conversation is about. Price leaves smiling. He is patient, pleasant, and implacable. He is also, as it happens, a thief. But we are not quite there yet. Lady Marguerite Calder arrives at the shop 2 days later, ebony walking stick planted before her like a scepter, 3 shawls arranged with territorial precision, charcoal wool, black lace, deep plum velvet, layered as though she is fortifying herself against siege. She lowers herself into the shop's only chair, with the care of a woman settling onto a throne, and orders a shawl mended. A commission so small, it is barely a pretext. It is not meant to be. While Eleanor works, fingers steady, needle precise, the thin brass ring on her right hand catching the window light, Lady Marguerite speaks. About her own youth, about a winter when she was 23 and proud, and had 4 shillings to her name and a dead father's debts around her neck like a millstone. About refusing help until the help changed its shape into something she could accept without losing herself. There is a difference, Lady Marguerite says, pale blue eyes sharp as broken glass behind the spectacles pushed up on her forehead, between a gift that makes you smaller and a gift that makes you free. The trick is knowing which is which. Most men never learn the difference. 1 or 2 do. Eleanor says nothing, but her needle pauses just for a breath before it resumes. Now, Julian's grand gesture, but not the one anyone expects. He doubts pay her rent. He does not buy her shop. He does not ride in on a white horse with a bag of gold and a speech about how she deserves better, because he has finally understood that she does not want better. She wants what is hers. So he goes to the county records office and spends 2 days and £14 in clerking fees researching the title history of the Threadwell Lane properties. Wattick Eleanor's father, before his debts consumed him, held a freehold interest in the cottage adjoining the chandler's shop, a tiny property worth perhaps £47 per annum, seized by Price's predecessor through a legal manoeuvre of questionable validity when the elder Voss died. The freehold was Eleanor's birthright. Price has been collecting rent on property that should have descended to her. Julian does not deliver this himself. He has learned, painfully, at the cost of everything he wanted, that the messenger matters as much as the message. He engages an independent solicitor from Whitbury to prepare the documentation and deliver it to Miss Voss directly. The deed, the title search, the legal opinion. No letter, no card, no gift. Only the facts, because Eleanor is a woman who trusts facts. Eleanor opens the envelope, reads the deed, reads it again, and sits down very slowly in her mending chair, because for the first time in 9 years, someone has given her something that does not ask her to be less than she is. The deed lay in her lap like a living thing, not a gift. That is the first thing Eleanor understood, sitting there in the mending chair with the grey wool dress smoothed beneath her and the leather-bound notebook pressing against her hip from the deep pocket where it always rested. Not a gift, because a gift implies a giver who wants to be seeing giving. This working else entirely. This cases, a fact, delivered as facts ought to be delivered, plainly, without flourish, without a man standing in the doorway waiting to be thanked. Julian had not brought it himself, and that, more than anything written on the page, was what broke her open. He had engaged a solicitor from Whitbury, a Mr. Alderton, A man Eleanor had never met. A man with no connection to Sternfield, no debt to a duke, no reason to shade the truth in any direction. Independent, impartial. The kind of man who dealt in title searches and property law, and who would not, under any circumstances, include a personal note from a client who had not asked him to. The envelope had arrived by post, not by liveried footman. It bore a Whitbury frank and a plain wax seal. Inside, the deed to the cottage and its 3 acres, the complete title search going back 47 years, and a legal opinion, 4 pages, closely written, confirming that Eleanor's tenancy had been improperly converted to a revocable license by Edmund Price in the spring of 1809, in direct violation of the original terms set down by the late Mr. Harwood, and that the property rights reverted, fully and without condition, to Miss Eleanor Voss. No letter from Julian, no card, no sprig of dried lavender tucked between the pages, no line reading, "I hope you will allow me," or "if you would but consider." Nothing that asked, nothing that presumed. Only the facts, laid out in a solicitor's careful hand, because Julian had learned, painfully, at the cost of every impulse that had driven him to her door, with declarations she had not invited, that Eleanor was a woman who trusted facts the way other women trusted promises. And facts do not require gratitude. Facts simply are. She read the deed once. She read it again. The figures were specific: 3 acres, 1 roods, 17 perches. The cottage, the garden, the strip of meadow where the hives stood in their whitewashed rows. Hers. Not borrowed, not tolerated, not permitted by the patience of a man who could revoke the permission whenever her refusal to be diminished became inconvenient. The thin brass ring on her right hand caught the late afternoon light as she turned the page, and her hands were steady, because Eleanor's hands were always steady, but something behind her face was not. She did not cry. She had not cried in 9 years, and she was not about to begin now over a property deed. But she sat very still in the mending chair, with the loose strands of honey-blonde hair falling against her temples, and the freckles scattered across her nose, catching the low sun through the window. And she breathed again, and she understood that someone had seen her. Not the poverty, not the pride, not the stubborn chin or the direct amber-brown eyes that made comfortable men uncomfortable, but the architecture of the life she had built, the whole of it. The bees and the mended cuffs, and the notebook with its pencil stub, and the refusal, the absolute granite refusal, to be made into a thing. Someone had seen all of it, and had not tried to improve it, or replace it, or rescue her from it. Someone had simply removed the one man who had been standing on her neck. Edmund Price, incidentally, had nothing left to hold. The legal opinion was devastating in its quietness. 4 pages of precedent and citation that reduced his years of patient, smiling, reasonable cruelty to a single administrative error, correctable by any competent magistrate. No drama, no confrontation, no duke sweeping in to save anyone. Just the law, applied correctly, by an independent solicitor who had no interest in making anyone feel heroic. Price's slim black leather portfolio, his pearl stick-pin, his immaculate white gloves, and his slow blinking dark eyes, all of it rendered irrelevant. Not defeated, irrelevant. Which was worse, and which was, Eleanor thought with something that might have been the ghost of a smile, exactly right. 3 weeks passed before she wrote to Julian. 3 weeks in which she repaired the Eastern hive, balanced her accounts for the quarter, £11 earned, £9 spent, a surplus of £2 she allocated to new muslin and a £0.5 of good tea, and did not once feel obligated to feel anything she did not actually feel. When she did write, the letter was 4 lines long. It said, in its entirety. The deed is correct. The solicitor was thorough. I am in your debt for the referral, which I will repay at the rate of 1 pot of honey per annum until you ask me to stop. I remain, Miss Voss. Julian read it in the study at Sternfield with the gold pocket watch in his left waistcoat pocket and the pale grey eyes that were almost silver in strong light fixed on the page, and his thin, expressive mouth did something it had not done in years. It curved. Not the pressed flat line of displeasure, not the careful composure of a man who had learned to want nothing that could refuse him. An actual smile, unguarded and slightly bewildered, as though he had forgotten the muscles required for it and was relearning them from scratch. He did not write back. He sent no reply, no acknowledgement, no counteroffer. He simply instructed his kitchen to expect a pot of honey once a year from an unnamed source and to place it on the breakfast table without comment. 7 years later, 7 years of honey delivered and received, 7 years of chance meetings at the Whitbury market that grew gradually less chance and more deliberate. 7 years of arguments in which both of them were right about different things and neither yielded. They sat together at a small writing desk in the cottage, 2 greying heads bent over a ledger, and Eleanor said without looking up, "You are sitting in my mending chair." And Julian, who had once commanded a cavalry regiment and held £11,000 a year and believed that safety lay in wanting nothing, said quietly, "I know." The brass ring still caught the light. The notebook still sat at her hip. The hives still stood in their whitewashed rows in the meadow that had always been hers. Some debts are never repaid because they were never really debts at all. They were just 2 people, finally, telling the truth at the same time.